words came out of nowhere, soft and fast, brushed against Alistair Whitmore's ear like a blade wrapped in silk. "Your interpreter is lying." He turned, but the maid was already gone, slipping between two footmen carrying silver trays, her grey dress vanishing into the crowd of the grand hall. For a moment Alistair stood frozen, the warmth of the reception pressing against him, laughter and clinking glasses filling the air, while those 4 words sat in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He looked across the room to where Monsieur Delacroix stood beside the foreign delegation, speaking in low, fluent tones to the visiting minister from the eastern coast. Delacroix had served the Whitmore estate for 6 years. He had translated treaties, trade agreements, letters between kings. He had accompanied Alistair's late father on diplomatic journeys across 3 countries, and when the old duke passed, Delacroix had stayed on without hesitation, offering his loyalty to the son as readily as he had given it to the father. He had never once given Alistair reason to doubt him. And yet, Alistair forced his face into calm interest and walked toward the cluster of guests, his polished shoes silent on the marble floor. The chandeliers above threw gold light across the room, catching on jeweled collars and crystal glasses, but none of it mattered now. His mind was fixed on one thing only, the sound of that whisper, and the certainty in the maid's voice. She had not sounded afraid. She had sounded sure. He reached the group just as Delacroix finished a sentence and turned to him with a practiced smile. "Your Grace," Delacroix said smoothly, "Minister Farrow was just expressing his satisfaction with the terms we discussed this morning. He says your generosity has impressed the entire delegation." Alistair studied the minister's face. The man's expression did not match the words. There was tension in his jaw, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of frustration, not satisfaction. It was subtle, the kind of thing most men would miss entirely. But Alistair had spent years reading faces across negotiating tables, and something in this exchange felt wrong. "Tell the minister," Alistair said carefully, "that I am equally pleased, and that I look forward to finalizing the details tomorrow." Delacroix turned and spoke again, his voice fluid, confident. The minister's frown deepened for just a heartbeat before he nodded politely and offered a thin smile. That heartbeat was enough. Alistair excused himself and stepped back from the group, his pulse quickening in a way it rarely did anymore. He was a duke. He had faced hostile courts, rival houses, men who wanted his land and his title. He had negotiated with merchants who tried to cheat him, and nobles who smiled while plotting against his family's fortune. He did not startle easily, but the gap between what he had said and what the minister's face showed him was too wide to ignore. He thought back over the past hour, trying to recall anything unusual about the maid. He could not remember seeing her at any of his previous gatherings. That in itself was strange. His household staff rarely changed, and he prided himself on knowing the names and faces of those who served under his roof, even if he did not always speak to them directly. Yet her face was new to him, or nearly so, a face he might have passed a dozen times without truly seeing. That was the trouble with a large household, he realized. Servants moved through the background of his life like furniture, present and useful but rarely noticed. It was an uncomfortable thought, and one he did not have time to dwell on now. He needed to find the maid. He moved through the hall, past groups of nobles exchanging pleasantries, past a string quartet playing near the far windows, his eyes scanning every gray uniform among the staff. Servants were meant to be invisible at gatherings like this, present but unseen, and tonight that invisibility worked against him. He caught glimpses of maids carrying trays, refilling glasses, clearing empty plates, but none of them were her. He remembered her face only vaguely. Dark hair pulled back tightly, pale eyes, sharp and watchful. She had looked at him for only a second before she spoke and disappeared. But something about that look stayed with him. It was not the look of a servant who feared punishment for speaking out of turn. It was the look of someone who understood exactly what she was risking, and had decided it was worth the risk anyway. Near the servants' entrance at the back of the hall, he finally spotted her. She was standing beside a table of empty trays, straightening the folds of a tablecloth with quick, precise movements. When she sensed him approaching, her hands stilled. "You," Alistair said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that no one nearby would hear. She lifted her chin and met his eyes without flinching. "Your Grace. What you said. Explain it." Her gaze flicked past him, toward the crowd, toward Delacroix still speaking with the delegation. "Not here," she said. "Too many ears." Alistair felt a flash of irritation, the instinct of a man used to immediate answers from those beneath him, but he swallowed it. If she was right, if Delacroix truly was betraying him in the middle of a negotiation that could shape trade agreements for the next decade, then caution mattered more than his pride. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "the study, before the household wakes." She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes, Your Grace." He turned and walked back into the hall, forcing his shoulders to relax, his expression to smooth into practiced ease. But his mind was already working, turning over the pieces of the evening, replaying every conversation Delacroix had translated over the past weeks. If the interpreter had lied even once, how many other conversations had been twisted? How many agreements had been built on false words? The rest of the reception passed in a blur of forced smiles and careful silence. Alistair said little, listened more, and watched Delacroix with new eyes. He noticed things he had never bothered to notice before. The way Delacroix's gaze sometimes lingered on certain guests a moment too long. The way his translations sometimes ran longer than the original sentence, as if he were adding something that had never been said. He thought of every trade route Delacroix had negotiated on his behalf, every letter sealed and sent to foreign courts under the belief that the words within them carried his true intentions. If even a fraction of those had been altered, the damage could reach further than a single evening's negotiation. It could touch alliances his family had spent generations building. By the time the guests began departing into the cool night air, carriages lining the drive, torches flickering against the dark, Alistair's certainty had hardened into something colder and more determined. He would not accuse Delacroix without proof. A wrong accusation against a trusted servant of 6 years would damage his reputation and unravel trust within his own household, but he would not ignore this either. He stood on the front steps, nodding farewell to departing guests, his mind elsewhere entirely. Minister Farrow paused before him, offering a final handshake through Delacroix's translation, his words polite and formal. But his eyes told a different story, distant and guarded. The eyes of a man who felt something had gone wrong in negotiations he did not fully understand. When the last carriage rolled away and the hall finally emptied, Alistair remained standing in the entrance for a long moment, staring out at the darkened drive. 6 years of trust, built conversation by conversation, treaty by treaty. And now a maid he barely knew had shattered it with 4 whispered words. He climbed the stairs to his private study, the candlelight throwing long shadows across the shelves of books and ledgers that lined the walls. He sat behind his desk and pulled out the notes from the day's negotiations, reading through them again, searching for anything that might confirm or deny what he had been told. Nothing on paper could tell him the truth. Only tomorrow's conversation could do that. Sleep did not come easily that night. He lay awake turning over the maid's words, wondering what she knew, how she knew it, and why she had chosen to risk her position to tell him. Servants who accused senior staff of wrongdoing rarely fared well, regardless of whether their accusations proved true. She had to know that, and yet she had spoken anyway, quickly, quietly, and without hesitation. There was courage in that, or desperation. He could not yet tell which. As the first gray light of dawn crept through his window, Alistair rose from his bed, dressed without calling for his valet, and made his way down to the study. The household was still mostly asleep, the halls quiet except for the distant sound of servants beginning their morning duties in the kitchens below. He reached the study and found her already waiting outside the door, standing perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her, her expression unreadable. In the pale morning light, without the noise and color of the reception around her, she looked younger than he had first thought, and more tired. "You came," he said. "I said I would." He unlocked the study and gestured for her to enter first, an unusual courtesy for a duke to offer a maid, but he found he did not care about propriety this morning. He closed the door behind them and turned to face her, the early light casting long shadows across the room. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning, and do not leave anything out." She took a slow breath, glancing once toward the window, as if gathering the courage to say what came next. Outside, the sky had turned from gray to a pale, uncertain blue, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster called out over the fields. It was an ordinary sound on an ordinary morning, and yet nothing about this moment felt ordinary at all. Alistair sat down slowly behind his desk, folding his hands together, forcing himself into the stillness he used whenever he needed to listen carefully. He had learned long ago that the most important information often came wrapped in hesitation, and that a man who rushed another to speak rarely heard the full truth. So he waited, letting the silence stretch, giving her the space to find her words. She did not sit, though he had not offered her a chair, and she did not look away from him either. There was something steady in the way she held herself, shoulders back, chin level, that reminded him less of the maids who scurried through his halls with downcast eyes and more of the diplomats who sat across from him during negotiations, calculating every word before it left their mouths. Then she began to speak, and with every sentence, Alistair felt the careful order of his world tilting further off its axis. "My name is Alira," she said, her voice steady despite the early hour. "I have worked in this house for 8 months. Before that, I lived near the eastern coast, in a trading town where merchants from Minister Pharaoh's country came often. I learned their language as a child, from the market sellers and the sailors who stayed in the inn where my mother worked." Alistair leaned forward slightly. "You understand their tongue?" "Fluently, Your Grace. I have understood every word spoken by the delegation since they arrived 3 days ago, and I have understood every word Monsieur Delacroix has translated for you, which is how I know they do not match." The room felt suddenly smaller, the weight of her claim pressing against the walls. Alistair kept his voice level, though his mind was racing. "Give me an example, something specific." Alira did not hesitate. "Yesterday afternoon, when you offered the delegation reduced tariffs on textile shipments in exchange for exclusive trade rights along the northern route, Minister Pharaoh expressed concern about the length of the exclusivity agreement. He said, in his own language, that 10 years felt excessive, and he wished to propose 5. Monsieur Delacroix told you the minister was pleased with the terms and had no objections." Alistair felt something cold settle in his stomach. He remembered that exact moment clearly, remembered Delacroix's confident translation, remembered feeling satisfied that the negotiation was proceeding smoothly. If what Alira said was true, an entire clause of the agreement had been misrepresented, and he had nearly signed a treaty built on a lie. "Why would he do this?" Alistair asked, more to himself than to her. "I do not know his reasons, Your Grace. I only know what I have heard." He studied her face carefully, searching for any sign of deception, any flicker of hesitation that might suggest she was fabricating this story for some hidden purpose of her own. But she met his gaze without wavering, and there was something in her steadiness that he found difficult to dismiss. "Why tell me now? Why not sooner, if you suspected something on the first day?" For the first time since entering the study, Alira's composure faltered slightly. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "I was afraid, Your Grace. A maid accusing a trusted interpreter of deception, with no proof beyond her own word, could easily lose her position. Or worse. I told myself it was not my place to interfere in matters far above my station." "What changed?" "Last night, I watched you shake Minister Pharaoh's hand as he left, and I saw the same look on his face that I had seen all week. Frustration, distrust. He believes you are the one negotiating in bad faith, Your Grace, because Delacroix has told him things in return that do not match what you actually said. Both sides believe the other is lying, and only Delacroix knows the truth sits somewhere in between." Alistair sat back in his chair, absorbing the full weight of what she had just described. It was not simply a matter of Delacroix lying to him. The interpreter was actively poisoning both sides of the negotiation, feeding each party false information about the other, creating suspicion and resentment where there should have been cooperation. If this continued, the treaty would collapse entirely, and worse, it could damage relations between the two nations for years to come. "I could not stay silent any longer," Alira continued. "Whatever the cost to me, I decided I would rather tell you the truth and lose my position than watch you walk into a treaty built on lies." The room fell quiet. Alistair rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens below, where the morning mist still clung to the hedges. He needed proof. Something beyond a maid's word, however sincere it sounded. An accusation without evidence was worthless, and worse, it could destroy an innocent man's reputation if he was wrong. "I believe you," he said finally, turning back to face her. "But belief is not enough. I need proof that will hold up if I confront him, or if I must explain this to Minister Pharaoh directly." "What kind of proof, Your Grace? I need to see it happen myself. I need to understand what he is truly saying, in real time, without relying on his translation." Alira's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, Alistair saw something like surprise cross her careful expression. "You wish me to translate for you? In secret?" "Not yet. First, I want to test him. Directly. I will say something specific in the next meeting, something that only a truthful translation could convey properly. If his version to the delegation matches what I actually said, then perhaps I am wrong, and yesterday's discrepancy was some innocent error. But if it does not match, then you will know for certain," Alira finished quietly. "Yes." He returned to his desk and began sketching out a plan, his mind sharpening now that he had a clear course of action ahead of him. The negotiation was scheduled to resume that afternoon, A final session before the delegation departed the following morning to carry the signed treaty back to their king. It would be the last opportunity to catch Delacroix, if indeed he was betraying them. "I will need you present," Alistair said. "Not obviously. Among the staff, serving refreshments, as you would normally. But close enough to hear everything, and afterward, you will tell me exactly what was said, in full, without omission." Alira nodded slowly. "I can do that, Your Grace. But if Monsieur Delacroix realizes I understand the language, he may become more careful. Or dangerous." Alistair had not considered that possibility, and the thought settled uneasily in his chest. Delacroix had never struck him as a man capable of cruelty, but 6 years of trust had already proven unreliable, in ways he could not have imagined a day earlier. He did not know what the man was truly capable of if his deception was exposed. "Then we will be careful," Alistair said. "You will say nothing, do nothing, that draws attention to yourself. You are simply a maid, pouring tea, nothing more. And if he already suspects something? If last night someone saw me speak to you." Alistair paused, remembering the crowded hall, the dozens of guests and staff moving through the reception. It was possible someone had noticed their brief exchange near the servants' entrance, though he had been careful to keep his voice low and his expression neutral. Still, he could not be certain. "We proceed carefully regardless," he said. "There is no other option. If I cancel today's session or postpone it without explanation, it will raise questions I cannot answer without revealing what I know. The treaty must move forward as planned, at least on the surface." Alira agreed, though he could see the tension in her shoulders, the quiet fear she was working hard to conceal. He respected her for it, for showing up despite that fear, for speaking the truth when silence would have been far safer for her. The hours before the afternoon session passed slowly. Alistair reviewed his notes from previous meetings, searching for any other moments where Delacroix's translations might have shifted the meaning of what was said. He found 3 more instances that, in hindsight, felt suspicious, moments where the delegation's reactions had not quite matched the words Delacroix relayed to him. He had dismissed them at the time as simple misunderstandings, cultural differences in expression. Now he wondered how much had been lost, or twisted, in translation. He also sent a quiet message to Alira's supervising housekeeper, requesting that Alira be assigned to serve refreshments during the afternoon session, framing it as a routine staffing decision rather than anything unusual. The housekeeper, a longtime servant of the estate named Margaret Colby, agreed without question, unaware of the true purpose behind the request. By the time the delegation arrived that afternoon, filing into the formal meeting room with its long oak table and tall windows overlooking the eastern gardens, Alistair felt a tension coiled tightly in his chest that he worked hard to keep hidden. Minister Farrow entered alongside 2 advisors, their expressions polite but guarded, and Delacroix followed close behind, greeting each of them with practiced warmth. Alistair took his seat at the head of the table, watching as the delegation settled into their chairs across from him. Alira entered moments later, carrying a silver tray laden with tea and refreshments, moving quietly along the edges of the room exactly as any maid would. She did not look at him. She did not look at Delacroix. She simply performed her role, pouring tea into porcelain cups, refilling water glasses, blending seamlessly into the background of the room. Alistair cleared his throat and began. "Minister Farrow, before we finalize the remaining terms, I want to address something directly. I understand there was concern yesterday regarding the length of the exclusivity agreement on the northern trade route." He watched Delacroix carefully as the man translated the sentence. The interpreter's expression remained perfectly calm, his voice smooth and unhurried. But Alistair noticed a fraction of a pause before he spoke, a hesitation so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not watching for it. Minister Farrow's face shifted as Delacroix spoke, a flicker of confusion crossing his features before he responded in his own language, his tone questioning. Delacroix turned back to Alistair. "The minister says he has no memory of raising such a concern, Your Grace. He believes the 10-year term was agreed upon without issue." Alistair felt his pulse quicken, though he kept his expression neutral. It was exactly as Alira had described. The lie had not only been told once, it was being reinforced now, layered deeper into the false narrative Delacroix had constructed between them. "Strange," Alistair said carefully. "I could have sworn there was some discussion of adjusting the term to 5 years." Delacroix's smile did not waver. "Perhaps a misunderstanding, Your Grace. These negotiations move quickly, and details can blur." Alistair nodded slowly, giving nothing away, though inside he felt the last of his doubt crumble away entirely. There was no misunderstanding here. There was only a carefully maintained deception, and he had just watched it happen with his own eyes. He glanced, Just once, toward the edge of the room, where Alira stood pouring tea for one of the minister's advisors. She did not look up, did not react in any visible way, but he saw the slight tightening of her hands around the teapot, the only sign that she too had heard the lie unfold exactly as she had warned him it would. The rest of the session continued for nearly 2 hours, moving through the remaining points of the treaty one by one. Alistair listened to every translation with new suspicion, cataloging each exchange in his memory, waiting for the moment when the meeting would end and he could finally hear the truth in full from someone he could trust. When the delegation finally rose to depart, exchanging polite farewells and promises to reconvene the following morning for the formal signing, Alistair remained seated at the head of the table, watching Delacroix escort the guests toward the door with the same easy confidence he always carried. Nothing in the man's demeanor suggested guilt or fear. He moved through the room like a man who believed himself untouchable. Once the room had emptied and the door closed behind the last departing advisor, Alistair finally allowed himself to exhale, the tension of the past 2 hours draining from his shoulders. He turned toward the corner of the room, where Alira remained, quietly stacking empty cups onto her tray, waiting for his signal. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. "Every word." She set down the tray and began to speak, and as she recounted the session point by point, comparing what Delacroix had actually translated against what the minister and his advisors had truly said, Alistair felt the full scope of the betrayal settle over him like a weight he could not yet fully measure. 6 years of trust, and it had all been a careful, deliberate performance. Alira's account matched everything Alistair had suspected, and more. She described how Delacroix had softened every point of tension the delegation raised, smoothing away objections that should have reached Alistair's ears, while simultaneously telling the delegation that Alistair had refused to compromise on issues he had never even addressed. It was not simple deception. It was a calculated effort to make both sides believe the other was acting in bad faith. "He told the minister," Alira said, "that you dismissed his concerns about the tariff structure as unreasonable, and that you called the delegation's counteroffer insulting. You said no such thing. I heard every word you spoke, and none of it matched what he claimed." Alistair sat in silence for a long moment, his hands pressed flat against the polished surface of the table. The scope of it was staggering. 6 years of careful, patient work, building trust between two houses, two nations, and Delacroix had spent the past 3 days quietly dismantling all of it from within, using words as his weapon, knowing that neither side could catch him without someone who understood both languages. Why would he do this? Alistair asked again, though he suspected Alira had no more answer to this question than she had earlier that morning. "I do not know his motives, Your Grace, but I know what I heard, and I know it was deliberate. A man does not accidentally invent an entire conversation that never happened." Alistair rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the window, staring out at the gardens without truly seeing them. His mind moved through possibilities. Perhaps Delacroix had been bribed by a rival house, someone who wanted the treaty to collapse and drag the Whitmore name through scandal in the process. Perhaps he held some personal grudge Alistair knew nothing about. Or perhaps it was simpler than that, a matter of money, an offer too tempting to refuse from someone willing to pay for chaos. Whatever the reason, one thing was clear. He could not confront Delacroix directly, not yet. If he accused the interpreter now, with only Alira's word as evidence, Delacroix could simply deny everything, and it would become his word against hers, a duke's trusted interpreter of 6 years against a maid of 8 months. Alistair knew exactly how that confrontation would look to anyone watching, regardless of where the truth actually lay. He needed something undeniable, something that would leave no room for denial, no space for Delacroix to twist the situation back in his favor. "I have a plan," Alistair said, turning back to face her, "but it will require your continued help, and it will require both of us to move very carefully." Alira straightened slightly, her earlier fear giving way to something steadier, more resolute. "Tell me what you need, Your Grace. Tomorrow morning, the treaty is meant to be signed. Before that happens, I intend to create a private meeting with Minister Farrow, without Delacroix present. I will need you to translate. Openly? In front of Delacroix, or the household? No. Privately, before the formal signing. I will invite the minister to walk the gardens with me before breakfast, under the pretense of enjoying the morning air. You will accompany us as my attendant, close enough to translate quietly between us, while Delacroix remains occupied elsewhere." Alira considered this for a moment. "How will you ensure Delacroix does not join you? He has attended every meeting with the delegation since their arrival. He will find it strange if he is suddenly excluded." It was a fair question, and Alistair had already turned it over in his mind. "I will tell him I wish to review the final treaty documents alone this morning. to ensure every clause is correct before the signing. It is not unusual for a duke to want privacy with his own paperwork. He will have no reason to insist on joining a private walk in the garden, especially if he believes I am occupied elsewhere with the documents. And if the minister refuses the invitation, or if he mentions it to Delacroix beforehand? Alistair had considered this too. I will send the invitation directly to the minister's private quarters tonight, written by my own hand, with no involvement from Delacroix at all. If the minister agrees, and I believe he will, since he clearly wishes to understand the true nature of these negotiations as much as I do, then Delacroix will have no opportunity to interfere. Elira nodded slowly, though Alistair could see the calculations still turning behind her eyes. There is risk in this, Your Grace. If Delacroix suspects anything, if he sees me leave the household grounds with you and the minister tomorrow morning, he may act quickly to protect himself. A man who has lied this thoroughly for this long will not simply accept discovery quietly. I know, Alistair said, which is why we will be careful, and why this conversation stays between the two of us until it is finished. No one else in the household should know what we are planning, not Margaret, not the other staff, no one. Understood, Your Grace. They spent the next half hour refining the details of the plan, working through every possible complication. Alistair would write the invitation to the minister that evening, careful with his wording, framing the private walk as an opportunity for quiet reflection before the formalities of the signing ceremony. Elira would rise early, well before the rest of the household staff began their duties, and wait near the eastern garden entrance, ready to serve as his attendant the moment the minister arrived. As they talked, Alistair found himself watching Elira more closely than he intended, noting the sharp, careful way she thought through each possible obstacle, considering angles he had not yet thought of himself. She was not simply a maid who happened to understand a foreign language. She thought like someone accustomed to navigating danger, someone who understood consequences and weighed them with unusual precision for a young woman only 8 months into service. "May I ask you something?" he said when their planning had reached a natural pause. "Of course, Your Grace. Why work as a maid at all? If you speak a foreign language fluently, if you understand negotiation and risk as clearly as you seem to, you could have sought far more valuable positions. Interpreters are well paid. Advisors, even more so." Elira's expression shifted, something guarded settling over her features. "It is not so simple as choosing a position, Your Grace. Interpreters are hired through recommendations, through connections within noble houses or trading guilds. A woman with no family name, no patron, no letters of introduction, does not simply walk into such positions, regardless of her skill. You had no one to vouch for you. My mother worked in an inn her entire life. She died 2 years ago. I have no family beyond her, no connections beyond the ordinary people I grew up among. Service in a great house was the only path open to someone like me, and I took it because it offered food, shelter, and safety. It was never meant to be permanent." There was something in the way she said this, a quiet resignation mixed with quiet determination, that struck Alistair more than he expected. He had never given much thought to the lives of the staff who moved through his household each day, the paths that had led them there, the ambitions they carried beneath their uniforms. It was an uncomfortable realization that a woman with this much intelligence and courage had been overlooked simply because she lacked the right connections. "What did you hope for then, before you came here?" Elira met his gaze steadily. "I hoped to be useful in some way that mattered, to use what I knew for something beyond serving tea and clearing plates. I did not expect that hope to come true so soon, or under such strange circumstances." Alistair found himself, unexpectedly, without a ready response. He studied her for a long moment, seeing past the gray uniform and the careful posture of a servant, seeing instead the sharp mind and quiet resolve that had led her to risk everything the night before, whispering 4 words to a duke she barely knew, simply because she could not stand by and watch him walk into a lie. "You have been useful," he said finally, "more than you know." A faint color rose in her cheeks, quickly controlled, and she looked away toward the window. "Thank you, Your Grace. I only did what seemed right. Not everyone would have done the same. Most would have stayed silent, protected their own position, and let the treaty fail or succeed without involving themselves in matters above their station, as you put it." "Perhaps," she said, "but I could not live with staying silent, knowing what I knew. Whatever consequences came from speaking, I decided they were easier to carry than the guilt of saying nothing." Alistair nodded slowly, something settling in his chest that he did not have time to fully examine, not with tomorrow's plan still requiring careful attention, but he filed the thought away regardless, aware that his view of the household around him, and of this particular maid, had shifted in ways he had not anticipated only a day earlier. They finished refining the plan as the afternoon light began to shift toward evening, the household slowly returning to its usual rhythm around them, unaware of the quiet conspiracy taking shape within the study's walls. Before Alira left to return to her regular duties, Alistair stopped her at the door. "One more thing," he said. "If this plan succeeds tomorrow, if we obtain proof of what Delacroix has done, there will be consequences for him, severe ones. I want you to understand that before we proceed, because once this begins, there is no undoing it." Alira held his gaze without flinching. "I understand, Your Grace. I understood that the moment I chose to speak to you last night. And you are certain, once this moves forward, your role in exposing him will not stay hidden forever. He will know, eventually, that you were the one who understood his lies." "I am certain," she said simply. "Some things matter more than staying hidden." Alistair watched her leave, the door closing quietly behind her, and stood alone in his study for a long while afterward, the weight of tomorrow's plan settling over him. He drafted the invitation to Minister Farrow that evening, choosing his words with unusual care, sealing it with his personal signet rather than the household seal, ensuring it would draw no attention from anyone who might see it delivered. He barely slept that night. His mind turned over every possible way the plan could go wrong, every way Delacroix might sense the shift happening around him and act to protect himself before the truth could be confirmed. He thought of Minister Farrow's guarded expression at the reception, the quiet frustration simmering beneath the man's polite exterior, and hoped it would be enough to make him receptive to an unusual invitation from a duke he barely knew. He thought, too, of Alira, of the steady courage in her voice as she agreed to whatever consequences might follow, and found himself hoping, more than he expected, that this plan would succeed not only for the sake of the treaty, but for her sake as well. She had risked everything for the truth. He did not intend to let that risk go to waste. Dawn arrived cold and gray, mist curling low across the gardens as Alistair made his way down the eastern path before the rest of the household had stirred. Alira was already waiting near the garden entrance, exactly as planned, her expression calm despite the early hour and the uncertainty of what the morning might bring. "No sign of the minister yet," she said quietly as he approached. "He will come," Alistair said, though he felt less certain than he sounded. The invitation was clear, and if he wishes to understand what has truly happened in these negotiations, he will not miss this opportunity. They stood together in silence, watching the mist shift slowly across the hedges, waiting for footsteps that would either confirm their plan or leave it stranded before it had even begun. Somewhere in the house behind them, Delacroix remained unaware, believing the morning would unfold exactly as every other morning had, with him at the center of every conversation, controlling every word exchanged between two nations who had no reason left to trust each other, except for the quiet efforts of a duke and a maid who refused to let a lie stand unchallenged. Minutes passed. Then, through the thinning mist, a figure appeared at the far end of the garden path, moving alone, without escort, exactly as Alistair had requested. Minister Farrow had come. He approached slowly, his coat drawn tight against the morning chill, his expression cautious but curious. When he reached them, his eyes moved briefly to Alira, then back to Alistair, a question forming on his face that he had no way to ask without an interpreter present. Alistair gestured toward the path ahead. "Thank you for coming, Minister. Please, walk with me." Alira stepped forward slightly and spoke in the minister's own language, her voice low and clear, translating Alistair's words exactly as they had been spoken. The minister's eyebrows rose in visible surprise, his gaze snapping to Alira with new attention. He responded quickly, his tone sharp with disbelief, and Alira turned to Alistair. "He asks how a servant of your household comes to speak his language so fluently, and whether this is some trick." "Tell him it is not a trick," Alistair said. "Tell him I have reason to believe our translator has not been honest with either of us, and that I wish to speak with him directly, through someone I trust, before the treaty is signed." Alira relayed the message. The minister's cautious expression shifted into something closer to alarm, and he began speaking rapidly, his words tumbling over one another with obvious relief, as though a weight he had carried for days was finally being set down. "He says," Alira translated, keeping pace with the flow of his words, "that he suspected something was wrong from the very first meeting. He says you seemed unreasonably rigid on points he never raised, and dismissive of concessions he offered freely. He believed you were negotiating in bad faith, and he nearly recommended his king withdraw from the treaty entirely." Alistair felt a mixture of relief and anger settle over him in equal measure. Relief that the truth was finally surfacing, anger at how close the entire agreement had come to collapsing because of one man's deception. Tell him the feeling was mutual. I believed the same of him and his delegation, based on what I was told. The three of them walked slowly along the garden path as the sun began to rise properly over the hedges, mist burning away in the growing light, while Alira carried each sentence carefully between two men who had spent 3 days believing the worst of one another for no reason at all. Minister Pharaoh described, point by point, every concession he had genuinely offered, every concern he had genuinely raised, and Alistair listened with growing certainty that Alira's account from the previous session had been entirely accurate. Ask him, Alistair said, if he would be willing to state all of this formally, in writing, with his own seal, describing what was truly discussed during these negotiations. Alira translated, and the minister nodded firmly, his expression hardening with the particular resolve of a man who had been deceived, and now intended to see the deception corrected. He spoke at length, and Alira relayed his answer. He says he will provide a full written account, and more than that, he says his own advisors witnessed several of these exchanges and can confirm his statement. He asks only one thing in return. What does he ask? He asks that whatever punishment you intend for the interpreter, it be carried out properly and publicly, so that his own king understands the fault lay with one dishonest man, and not with the intentions of your house. Alistair extended his hand, and the minister took it firmly, the gesture requiring no translation at all. Tell him I give my word. Delacroix will answer for what he has done, and the treaty will proceed on the honest terms we both intended from the beginning. As Alira translated this final promise, Alistair caught the minister's eyes flicking toward her once more, something like respect settling into his expression. He said something briefer this time, and Alira paused before translating, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time that morning. He says I should be an ambassador, Your Grace, not a maid. Alistair looked at her for a long moment, the morning light catching the sharp intelligence in her eyes, and found himself thinking that the minister was not wrong, but there would be time to consider that later. For now they had exactly what they needed, a witness willing to speak the truth, and proof enough to bring Delacroix's deception into the open at last. They arranged for the minister to deliver his written statement discreetly, before the formal signing ceremony began, sealed and ready to be presented the moment it was needed. As the minister turned to make his way back toward the guest quarters, careful to appear as though he had simply taken an early morning walk, Alistair remained in the garden with Alira, the mist now fully lifted, the day ahead heavy with everything still left to confront. We have what we need, he said quietly. Yes, Your Grace, but Delacroix does not yet know that. Alistair turned to look back toward the house, where somewhere inside, the interpreter was likely already awake, preparing for what he believed would be an ordinary day, the final day of a negotiation he thought he still controlled completely. He had no idea that the ground beneath him had already begun to shift, or that the woman who poured his tea each day understood every lie he had told far better than he could have imagined. Not yet, Alistair agreed, but he will. By the time the formal signing ceremony began that afternoon, the meeting room had been arranged with a different weight in the air than any session before it. Long tables draped in blue cloth held the treaty documents, ready for the final seals. Servants moved quietly along the edges of the room, refreshing glasses and adjusting chairs, the household staff performing their duties with the same practiced calm they always carried, unaware that today would not end as any of them expected. Alistair had spent the hours between the garden meeting and the ceremony reviewing every document tied to the treaty, checking each clause against his own memory of what had truly been discussed, cross-referencing his notes with the account Minister Pharaoh had provided in writing. Every detail matched. There was no longer any question in his mind about what had happened, only the matter of how to expose it in a way that left no room for Delacroix to twist the truth once more. He sat at the head of the table, watching Delacroix greet the delegation with the same easy confidence he always displayed, unaware that the ground had already shifted beneath him. Minister Pharaoh entered last, his expression carefully neutral, though Alistair caught the faint nod the minister gave him as he took his seat, a silent confirmation that everything remained as planned. Alira stood near the side table, arranging cups and saucers with quiet precision, her presence so ordinary that no one in the room gave her a second glance. Alistair found his eyes drawn toward her more than once as the ceremony began, though he forced his attention back to the matter at hand each time, aware that the coming minutes required every ounce of his focus. Delacroix opened the session with his usual polished introduction, welcoming the delegation and outlining the final points remaining before the treaty could be signed. Alistair let him speak, watching carefully, waiting for the right moment. Before we proceed with the signing, Alistair said, once Delacroix had finished, I would like to address something that has troubled me over the past several days. Delacroix's expression remained composed as he translated the statement, though Alistair noted the faint stillness that crossed his features, a stillness that had not been there during previous sessions. Perhaps the interpreter had begun to sense that something had changed, even if he could not yet identify what. Minister Farrow responded through Delacroix, his tone carefully neutral, asking what concerns Alistair wished to raise. Delacroix relayed the question smoothly, and Alistair almost admired the man's composure, even now, even as the walls began closing around him. "I have reason to believe," Alistair said, choosing his words with deliberate care, "that certain statements made during our negotiations were not accurately conveyed between myself and the delegation." This time, Delacroix's hesitation was unmistakable, a beat too long before he began translating, his voice slightly less steady than before. Alistair watched the minister's face as the translation reached him, and saw immediate recognition there, the confirmation that Delacroix's version of events, even now, did not fully match what Alistair had actually said. Minister Farrow raised a hand, cutting off whatever Delacroix intended to say next, and spoke directly, his tone firm. Delacroix paused, clearly caught off guard by the interruption, then began to translate, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. "The minister says," Delacroix relayed, "that he shares similar concerns, and welcomes the opportunity to clarify any misunderstandings." Alistair nodded slowly. "Then let us clarify them now, directly, without delay." He reached into the folder before him, and withdrew the sealed letter Minister Farrow had provided that morning, setting it on the table between them. The minister's eyes flicked to the letter, then to Delacroix, and something in his expression hardened. "This is a written statement," Alistair said, "prepared by Minister Farrow himself, describing in detail the true content of our negotiations over the past 3 days, witnessed and confirmed by his own advisors." The room went utterly still. Delacroix's gaze dropped to the letter, and for the first time since Alistair had known him, the interpreter's composure cracked entirely, a flicker of panic crossing his face before he forced it back into stillness. "Your Grace," Delacroix said quickly, his voice carrying an edge that had not been there moments before. "I am not certain what this letter claims, but I assure you, any discrepancies are simple matters of translation, nuances between languages that do not always—" "Read it," Alistair said, cutting him off. "Translate it for the room, now." Delacroix's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the letter, breaking the seal, his eyes scanning the contents rapidly. Alistair watched him closely, watched the color drain slowly from his face as he read line after line of the minister's careful account, each sentence describing conversations that bore little resemblance to what Delacroix had actually reported. "I cannot," Delacroix said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You cannot, or you will not." The room remained silent, every eye fixed on the interpreter now, the delegation's advisors exchanging glances of quiet confirmation, as though the letter merely put words to suspicions they had already begun to form on their own. "Allow me," Alistair said, and turned toward the side table, where Alara stood motionless, the tray of cups forgotten in her hands. "Alara, please translate the letter for the room." A ripple of surprise moved through the delegation, as Alara set down her tray and stepped forward, her expression calm, despite the weight of every gaze now turned toward her. She picked up the letter from where Delacroix had let it fall, and began to read, her voice clear and steady as she translated each line into perfect, unhurried English, confirming everything the minister had written, every distortion Delacroix had woven into 3 days of careful, deliberate lies. Delacroix stood frozen at his place near the table, watching the maid he had never once considered a threat dismantle 6 years of trust with nothing more than her own fluent voice. When Alara finished reading, the room remained silent for a long moment, the full weight of the revelation settling over everyone present. Minister Farrow spoke first, his voice sharp, and this time it was Alara who translated his words, since Delacroix seemed unable to find his own. "The minister says," Alara relayed, "that he trusts this account fully, and he wishes to know why his negotiations were deliberately sabotaged." All eyes turned to Delacroix. The interpreter's earlier composure had entirely dissolved, replaced by something closer to desperation, his eyes darting between Alistair, the minister, and Alara, searching for some path out of the corner he now found himself trapped within. "Your Grace," Delacroix began, his voice unsteady, "please, allow me to explain privately, without—" "You will explain here," Alistair said, his voice hard and final. "In front of the man you deceived and in front of the household you betrayed." Delacroix's shoulders sagged, the fight visibly draining out of him. He glanced once more toward Alara, something like resentment flashing across his face, before he finally spoke. "I was approached 3 weeks ago," he said quietly, "by a representative from a rival trading house. They offered a substantial payment if I ensured this treaty collapsed, or at minimum if I damaged relations between your house and the delegation badly enough to delay any agreement for years." The confession hung in the air, confirming everything Alistair had suspected but had not yet heard spoken aloud. He felt no satisfaction in hearing it, only a cold, settling anger at the depth of the betrayal, the calculated cruelty of a man willing to unravel years of diplomacy for personal gain. Alistair felt the room's attention settle fully on him now, the delegation waiting to hear how far this betrayal reached, whether it touched only their own negotiations or extended into some wider conspiracy against the Whitmore name. He kept his voice level, though anger simmered beneath the surface. "Which house?" Alistair demanded. Delacroix hesitated, and for a moment, Alistair thought he might refuse to answer. But something in the interpreter's expression shifted, a resignation settling over him, as he realized there was no longer any advantage in protecting the identity of his employer. "House Ashworth," he said finally. Alistair felt his jaw tighten at the name, a rival house that had long resented the Whitmore family's growing influence in trade negotiations along the eastern coast. It made a certain grim sense, the kind of quiet sabotage a rival might attempt rather than open confrontation, using deception instead of force to achieve what direct competition could not. Minister Farrow, upon hearing the translation of this confession, rose from his seat, his expression a mixture of anger and relief. Anger at the deception he had endured, relief that the true source of the conflict had finally been revealed, and that it had nothing to do with any genuine ill will from the Whitmore house itself. "Tell the minister," Alistair said to Alira, "that I offer my sincerest apology for what has occurred, and my assurance that the terms we discuss going forward will be conducted honestly, through a translator I trust completely." Alira relayed the message, and Minister Farrow responded with a firm nod, his earlier tension visibly easing as he extended his hand once more across the table, this time with genuine warmth rather than cautious formality. Alistair turned back to Delacroix, who stood alone now, isolated in the center of a room that had, moments earlier, treated him as an indispensable presence. "You will be escorted from this estate immediately, and you will not return. I will also be sending word to every house I have dealings with, informing them of what you have done here, so that no one else falls victim to the same deception." Delacroix opened his mouth as though to protest, then closed it again, seeming to understand that any further words would accomplish nothing. He was led from the room by 2 of the household guards, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the quiet defeat of a man whose careful scheme had finally, completely, unraveled. With Delacroix removed, the room settled into a different kind of tension, one tinged with relief rather than suspicion. The remaining details of the treaty were reviewed swiftly, this time with Alira serving as translator, her fluency evident to everyone present as she moved effortlessly between languages, ensuring every word exchanged between Alistair and the delegation carried its true, honest meaning. By the time the final documents were signed, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, and the mood in the room had shifted entirely from the guarded suspicion of the morning to something closer to genuine goodwill. Minister Farrow shook Alistair's hand warmly before departing, offering, through Alira's translation, his sincere hope that future dealings between their houses would be conducted with the same honesty that had ultimately saved this agreement. As the delegation filed out of the room, Alistair remained behind, watching Alira gather the treaty documents with careful, practiced hands, still dressed in the simple gray uniform of a household maid, though everyone in that room now understood she was something far more than that. "You did well today," Alistair said quietly, once the room had emptied. Alira looked up from the documents, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. "I only translated what was already there, Your Grace. You did more than that. You saved this treaty. You saved my reputation, and perhaps years of goodwill between 2 nations that could have been destroyed by one man's greed." She set down the papers and met his gaze directly, something unspoken passing between them in the quiet stillness of the empty room. "I am glad I did not stay silent." Alistair studied her for a long moment, aware that the events of the past 2 days had shifted something between them that extended far beyond the treaty now safely signed and sealed. She was no longer simply a maid who had happened to overhear a lie. She had become something else entirely, someone whose intelligence and courage he found himself unable to overlook, no matter how carefully he tried to maintain the proper distance expected between a duke and his household staff. "I will need a translator for future negotiations," he said finally, "a permanent one. Someone I can trust completely. Alira's eyes widened slightly, understanding dawning across her face. Your Grace, I am only... You are exactly what this house needs, Alistair said, cutting her off gently. And I do not intend to overlook that simply because it is unconventional. For the first time since he had known her, Alira seemed uncertain how to respond. The careful composure she had maintained through every dangerous moment of the past 2 days, finally giving way to something quieter, more vulnerable. Whatever she had expected when she whispered those 4 words to him at the reception, she had clearly not expected this. She had risked her position hoping only to prevent a lie from becoming a signed agreement, never imagining that her honesty might lead to an offer that would change the entire course of her life within the same household that had, until now, treated her as invisible. Your Grace, she said again, softer this time. Are you certain? A position such as this carries weight. Other members of your staff, your peers among the nobility, they may not accept a former maid stepping into a role of such importance. Let them object, Alistair said simply. I have spent 6 years trusting the wrong person because he came with the right credentials. I would rather trust the right person, regardless of where she began. But before she could answer, a sharp knock sounded at the door, and one of the household guards entered, his expression grim. Your Grace, he said, there is a matter requiring your immediate attention. It concerns the maid, Alira. A serious accusation has been made against her. Alistair turned sharply toward the guard, his earlier warmth replaced instantly by a cold, focused attention. What accusation? Housekeeper Margaret Colby reports that a valuable brooch has gone missing from the guest quarters used by one of the minister's advisors. A search was conducted, Your Grace, and the brooch was discovered hidden among the maid Alira's belongings. Alira's face drained of color. That is not possible. I have never gone near the advisor's quarters, and I have certainly never taken anything that did not belong to me. Alistair studied her closely, searching for any flicker of doubt in her denial, but found only genuine shock and confusion, the same steady honesty he had come to recognize over the past 2 days. Still, he knew accusations of theft, especially against household staff, could not simply be dismissed without investigation, regardless of his personal trust in her. Where is Margaret now? He asked the guard. Waiting outside, Your Grace, along with the advisor who reported the missing item. Bring them in. The guard departed, and Alistair turned back to Alira, keeping his voice low. Tell me honestly, is there any reason, any explanation at all, for why this brooch would be found among your things? None, Your Grace. I swear it. I have not entered the guest quarters at any point during the delegation's stay, beyond serving refreshments in the common rooms where staff are permitted. He believed her. The timing alone was suspicious enough to raise his guard, an accusation surfacing within minutes of Delacroix's public exposure and removal from the estate. It was too convenient, too precisely timed, to be coincidence. The door opened again, and Margaret Colby entered first, her expression tight with the particular discomfort of a longtime servant forced to bring troubling news to her employer. Behind her followed one of the delegation's junior advisors, a thin man named Bertram Coyle, who Alistair recognized from the negotiations, though the man had said little throughout the proceedings. Your Grace, Margaret began, I regret bringing this matter to you at such an hour, especially given everything else that has occurred today. But the accusation is serious, and I felt it required your immediate attention. Explain what happened, Alistair said. Mr. Coyle reported his missing brooch to me approximately 1 hour ago, Margaret said. A search of the staff quarters was conducted with his permission, and the item was discovered inside Alira's trunk, wrapped in a cloth beneath her spare uniform. Alistair turned his attention to Coyle. You are certain this is your brooch? Coyle produced the item from his coat pocket, a small, ornate piece set with dark stones, and held it out for inspection. Quite certain, Your Grace. It belonged to my late mother. I would recognize it anywhere. Alistair examined the brooch briefly before returning his attention to the room. And when did you first notice it missing? Sometime yesterday evening, Your Grace. I searched my quarters thoroughly before reporting it, in case I had simply misplaced it. Who had access to your quarters during that time? Coyle hesitated, glancing briefly toward Margaret before answering. Household staff, of course, for cleaning and refreshment, and the maid, Alira, was seen near the guest corridor yesterday afternoon. By whom? By me, Your Grace, Coyle said. I saw her myself, though I thought nothing of it at the time. Alistair felt something sharpen in his mind, a suspicion forming that he could not yet fully confirm. He turned to Alira. Were you in the guest corridor yesterday afternoon? No, Your Grace. I was serving refreshments in the main hall throughout the entire afternoon, as I have every day since the delegation arrived. Margaret assigned my duties herself. She can confirm my whereabouts. Margaret's brow furrowed slightly, and she considered the question carefully before answering. That is correct, Your Grace. Alira was assigned to the main hall yesterday afternoon. I do not recall her leaving that post at any point. Coyle's expression flickered, something uneasy passing across his features before he composed himself again. Perhaps I was mistaken about the exact time. It may have been another maid I saw. Alistair's suspicion sharpened further. A man who claimed certainty about a treasured family heirloom being stolen, yet grew uncertain the moment his account of events was directly challenged, was not behaving like a man simply reporting an honest theft. "Tell me, Mr. Coyle," Alistair said, keeping his tone deliberately calm. "How long have you served as an advisor to Minister Farrow?" "Nearly 4 years, Your Grace." "And in that time, have you had any dealings with House Ashworth?" The question landed like a struck bell, and Alistair watched carefully as Coyle's composure cracked, just slightly, a tightening around his eyes that mirrored the same reaction Delacroix had shown only hours earlier when confronted with the truth. "I do not see what relevance that holds, Your Grace," Coyle said, his voice noticeably tighter now. "It holds a great deal of relevance," Alistair said, "given that I have just exposed a conspiracy orchestrated by House Ashworth to sabotage this very treaty, using a paid interpreter to distort negotiations between myself and Minister Farrow. It would not surprise me if that same house had further reach within this delegation than we initially realized." Coyle said nothing, his jaw working silently as the accusation hung in the air. Margaret, sensing the shift in the room, glanced between Alistair and the advisor with growing unease. "Your Grace," Alira said quietly, "may I speak?" "Go ahead." "When was the brooch discovered in my trunk exactly?" Margaret answered. "Approximately 40 minutes ago, shortly after word began spreading through the household about the interpreter's dismissal." Alira nodded slowly, as though confirming something she had already suspected. "Then whoever placed it there did so after the negotiations concluded, likely after word of Monsieur Delacroix's exposure had already reached the staff quarters. I was present in this room throughout the entire afternoon, serving as translator during the final session. I did not return to the staff quarters at any point until after the signing concluded." Alistair turned to Margaret. "Is that accurate? Was Alira present in this room throughout the entire session?" "Yes, Your Grace. I saw her myself when I brought additional refreshments partway through the ceremony." "Then she could not have placed the brooch in her own trunk during that window, nor could she have stolen it from Mr. Coyle's quarters at any point this afternoon, since she was occupied here, in front of the entire delegation, myself included." The room fell silent. Coyle's face had gone pale, the careful mask of injured propriety slipping further with each passing second. Alistair studied him closely, piecing together the timeline with growing certainty. "Someone placed that brooch in Alira's trunk within the last 40 minutes, Alistair said, specifically to discredit her immediately following her role in exposing Delacroix's deception. Someone who understood that removing her credibility now, before she could be formally recognized for what she uncovered, would serve a very particular purpose." "Your Grace, this is absurd," Coyle said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. "I am merely reporting a theft. I have no connection to whatever conspiracy you believe you have uncovered." "Then you will not object," Alistair said, "to a search of your own quarters, to confirm there is nothing else missing, and to a formal accounting of your movements throughout the afternoon." Coyle's silence stretched a beat too long before he finally spoke. "That will not be necessary, Your Grace. I believe I may have been mistaken about the timing of the theft. Perhaps this was simply a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that led you to search the staff quarters and demand a maid's belongings be searched within the hour of her exposing a plot against this very negotiation," Alistair said. "I think we both understand this was no misunderstanding at all." He turned to the household guard still standing near the door. "Escort Mr. Coyle to a separate room and hold him there until Minister Farrow can be informed of this matter directly. He deserves to know that his own advisor may have played a part in undermining these negotiations, whether through direct involvement with House Ashworth or through some private arrangement of his own." Coyle opened his mouth as though to protest, then seemed to think better of it, allowing himself to be led from the room in tense, defeated silence. Margaret remained behind, her expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and relief. "Your Grace, I apologize for bringing this accusation to you without questioning it more carefully. First, I should have considered the timing more closely before conducting the search." "You acted appropriately, Margaret," Alistair said. "An accusation of theft cannot simply be ignored, regardless of circumstances. You followed proper procedure, and that is not a fault." Margaret nodded, though her gaze shifted toward Alira with something like quiet apology. I am sorry this happened to you, especially after everything you have done for this household today. You have nothing to apologize for, Alira said softly. You were only doing your duty. Margaret excused herself, leaving Alistair and Alira alone once more in the quiet room, the evening light now fading fully into dusk beyond the tall windows. Alira remained standing near the table, her earlier composure now visibly shaken, the events of the day finally catching up to her. I am sorry, Alistair said. You should not have had to face that, not after everything you risked to bring the truth forward. It seems the truth carries its own dangers, Alira said quietly. I suspected there might be consequences for speaking out, but I did not imagine they would come from within the very delegation I helped save. Whoever arranged that accusation underestimated how carefully the timeline would be examined, Alistair said. And they underestimated how far I am willing to go to protect someone who has earned my trust as completely as you have. Alira looked up at him, something vulnerable flickering across her expression before she composed herself once more. Thank you, Your Grace, for believing me, and for defending me, in front of everyone. I meant every word, Alistair said. You are exactly what this house needs. Nothing that happened tonight changes that. If anything, it confirms it. They stood together in the quiet room for a long moment, the events of the day settling around them like the fading light beyond the windows, the treaty secured, the true traitor exposed, and a second, smaller conspiracy unraveled within hours of its attempt. Yet Alistair understood, watching the careful steadiness return slowly to Alira's expression, that whoever had arranged tonight's failed accusation against her would not simply accept defeat without further attempts to protect whatever remained of House Ashworth's scheme. Word of the day's events spread quickly through the household, as such things always did. By the time supper was served below stairs, every servant in the estate had heard some version of the story, passed from kitchen to hallway to servants' quarters, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Some said the maid Alira had exposed a spy. Others whispered that she had been caught stealing and only escaped punishment through the Duke's personal intervention. The truth, as it often did, traveled slower than rumor. Alistair understood the danger in allowing gossip to shape the household's understanding of what had happened. If Alira was to take on a position as significant as the one he intended to offer her, she would need the respect of the staff around her, not whispered suspicion following her through every corridor. He could not simply elevate her quietly and hope the truth settled on its own. The following morning, before the household began its daily duties, Alistair called every member of his staff to gather in the main hall, from the housekeeper down to the youngest kitchen boy. It was an unusual request, one that immediately signaled something significant was about to be addressed, and the hall filled with quiet, curious murmurs as servants filed in from every corner of the estate. Alira stood near the back of the gathered staff, her expression uncertain, clearly unprepared for what Alistair intended to say. He had not warned her of this gathering in advance, wanting her reaction to be as genuine as everyone else's when the truth was laid out plainly. Yesterday, Alistair began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall. This household witnessed the exposure of a deception that could have damaged relations between our house and a foreign delegation for years to come. Monsieur Delacroix, who served this family faithfully for 6 years, was revealed to have accepted payment from a rival house to sabotage our negotiations through deliberate mistranslation. A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the gathered staff, many of them clearly hearing the full details for the first time. That deception was uncovered, Alistair continued, not by any advisor, not by any nobleman, but by a member of this very household. Alira, who has served as a maid in this estate for 8 months, recognized the deception because she understood the delegation's language fluently, and she risked her position, and potentially far more, to bring that truth to my attention. Every eye in the hall turned toward Alira, who stood frozen, color rising in her cheeks under the sudden weight of so much attention. Following this discovery, Alistair went on, a false accusation of theft was made against her, timed deliberately to discredit her, before her role in saving this treaty could be properly recognized. That accusation has been thoroughly investigated and proven false. The advisor responsible is being held for questioning regarding his own connections to the same conspiracy that employed Delacroix. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the silent hall before continuing. I want every member of this household to understand clearly what happened here, so that no rumor or misunderstanding takes root in its place. Alira acted with courage and honesty when silence would have been far safer for her. She saved this house from a scandal that could have unraveled years of careful diplomacy. And for that, she will be stepping into a new role within this household, serving as my official translator and advisor for future negotiations. The hall remained silent for a long moment, the announcement settling over the gathered staff. Then, slowly, Margaret Colby began to clap, and the gesture spread through the hall, servants who had known Alira only as a quiet, hard-working maid, now looking at her with something closer to respect and quiet admiration. Alira stood amid the applause, visibly overwhelmed, her earlier uncertainty giving way to something like disbelief. When the hall finally quieted and the staff began dispersing to their morning duties, she approached Alistair, her expression still caught somewhere between gratitude and astonishment. "You did not need to do that," she said quietly. "The position alone would have been enough." "The position alone would have left room for doubt," Alistair said, "for whispers that you had somehow schemed your way into favor, or that I had acted rashly out of some misplaced sense of obligation. I wanted no doubt left standing. You earned this, publicly and completely, and I intended for everyone in this house to understand that clearly." Alira studied him for a long moment, something warm and unguarded passing across her features before she carefully composed herself once more. "Thank you, Your Grace, for all of it." "You do not need to keep thanking me," Alistair said, a faint smile touching his mouth for what felt like the first time in days. "You saved this house. I am simply ensuring the house recognizes what it owes you." As the staff dispersed around them, returning to their morning duties with fresh whispers of admiration rather than suspicion, Alistair found himself watching Alira walk toward the servants' quarters one final time. Not as a maid preparing for another day of quiet, unnoticed service, but as a woman about to step into a role that would place her at his side in every negotiation to come. He did not yet know what House Ashworth intended to do next, now that both their interpreter and their advisor had failed, but he suspected they would not simply retreat quietly. Whatever came next, he intended to face it with Alira beside him, not hidden among the staff, but recognized fully for the intelligence and courage that had already changed the course of his household once. The battle over the treaty had ended, but something told him the battle over Alira's place within his household, and within his life, had only just begun. Bertram Coyle did not remain silent for long. Held under careful watch in a private room of the estate, he spent the first hour insisting his innocence, then the second hour demanding release, and by the third hour, when Minister Farrow himself arrived to question him directly, his resolve finally broke entirely. Alistair stood beside the minister as Alira translated the confession, watching Coyle's composure crumble piece by piece under the weight of his own guilt. The advisor admitted he had been contacted separately from Delacroix, approached by a different representative of House Ashworth who offered payment not to sabotage the negotiations directly, but to serve as a secondary safeguard, someone positioned to discredit anyone who threatened to expose the scheme. "When I heard the interpreter had been exposed," Coyle admitted, his voice hollow with resignation, "I knew the entire arrangement was unraveling. I panicked. I thought if I could discredit the maid before she was formally recognized, I could still salvage something from the wreckage, perhaps convince the minister the entire accusation against Delacroix was somehow exaggerated or false." Minister Farrow's expression darkened as Alira translated this admission, his earlier warmth toward his advisor replaced entirely by cold disappointment. He spoke sharply, and Alira relayed his words without softening their edge. "The minister says you have disgraced not only yourself but the delegation he represents, and that you will return home in shame, stripped of your position, to face judgment from his own king for accepting payment from a foreign house to sabotage negotiations you were meant to protect." Coyle said nothing further, his silence a quiet confirmation of everything already understood. He was led away under guard, to be held until arrangements could be made for his return home under the minister's direct supervision, his diplomatic career effectively ended by his own greed. With both conspirators exposed and removed, Alistair turned his attention to the matter of House Ashworth itself. The rival house had orchestrated two separate schemes to unravel the treaty, each one failing in turn, and Alistair had no intention of allowing such an attack to go unanswered. He spent the following days drafting careful correspondence to allies across the region, laying out precisely what House Ashworth had attempted, presenting evidence gathered from both Delacroix's confession and Coyle's admission. The response from the wider nobility was swift and decisive. Houses that had once maintained cautious neutrality toward Ashworth's ambitions now distanced themselves entirely, unwilling to associate with a house willing to sabotage international diplomacy through bribery and deceit. Within weeks, House Ashworth found itself isolated, its trade partnerships quietly withdrawn, its reputation among the nobility permanently tarnished by its own scheming. Alistair took no particular satisfaction in watching a rival house fall from grace through its own corruption. but he understood the necessity of ensuring such an attempt would not be repeated, either by Ashworth or by any other house tempted to follow a similar path. Diplomacy, he had learned through painful experience, depended entirely on trust, and trust, once broken, required decisive action to repair. House Ashworth, however, did not accept its collapse quietly. Word reached Alistair through one of his allies that Lord Ashworth himself, furious at the sudden loss of standing among the nobility, had begun spreading rumors through certain circles, suggesting that Alira's discovery of Delacroix's deception had been staged from the beginning, a convenient scandal invented by the Whitmore house to distract from its own failures in the negotiation. It was a desperate accusation, thin and easily disproven, but Alistair understood that even a thin rumor, repeated often enough among the right ears, could cause lasting damage. He raised the matter with Alira one evening, showing her the letter his ally had sent describing the rumors circulating through Ashworth's remaining allies. She read it carefully, her expression hardening with quiet anger rather than fear. "They cannot accept that their scheme failed through their own corruption," she said. "So now they wish to rewrite the story entirely, to make my honesty into some elaborate deception of your own making." "I do not intend to let that rumor stand unanswered," Alistair said. "Minister Farrow's written statement, along with Coyle's own confession, already provides more than enough evidence to dismantle any claim that this was staged. I will see that both documents are shared widely enough that no reasonable person could believe Ashworth's version of events." True to his word, Alistair spent the following weeks ensuring the full, documented truth reached every house and court that mattered. The minister's sealed letter and Coyle's signed confession circulated alongside careful explanations of the timeline, leaving no room for doubt about what had truly occurred. Lord Ashworth's rumors withered quickly under the weight of undeniable evidence, and within a month, the matter had settled entirely, House Ashworth's reputation sinking even further as its desperate attempt to rewrite history became just one more example of its dishonesty. There was one final, more dangerous attempt. Late one night, nearly 2 months after the treaty's signing, a household guard discovered an intruder attempting to access the estate's private study, where copies of the sensitive documents relating to Ashworth's conspiracy were kept under lock. The intruder was captured before reaching the documents, and under questioning, admitted he had been paid by a representative connected to Lord Ashworth's household, tasked with destroying any remaining written evidence of the scheme. Alistair took the incident with grave seriousness, doubling the estate's security and ensuring copies of every relevant document were stored safely in multiple locations, beyond the reach of any future attempt at destruction. He also sent a final, unambiguous message to Lord Ashworth directly, informing him that any further attempts against the Whitmore estate, whether through rumor, theft, or intrusion, would be met with a full and public accounting before the Crown itself, an accounting that would leave House Ashworth with nothing left to salvage. The message achieved its purpose. Lord Ashworth, already weakened and isolated, chose finally to retreat entirely from any further scheming, focusing instead on the difficult, quiet work of rebuilding whatever remained of his house's tarnished name. The threat, at last, had fully passed. Through all of this, Alira remained at his side, her role within the household transformed completely. From the quiet maid who had once moved unnoticed through crowded halls, she sat in on every negotiation that followed, her translations precise and honest, her insight into diplomatic nuance proving invaluable time and again. The household staff who had once seen her as simply another servant now regarded her with genuine respect, and even Margaret Colby, who had originally overseen her humble duties, found herself deferring to Alira's judgment on matters of etiquette when foreign dignitaries visited the estate. But it was not only within the walls of negotiation that Alistair found himself increasingly drawn to her. In the quiet hours after formal duties ended, he found reasons to seek her counsel on matters that had little to do with diplomacy at all, lingering in conversations about books she had read, places she hoped to visit, memories of the small trading town where she had grown up listening to sailors trade stories in a dozen different tongues. She, in turn, seemed to relax slowly in his presence, the careful guardedness she had carried since their first conversation in the study giving way, bit by bit, to something warmer, more open. He found himself looking forward to these quiet exchanges more than he cared to admit, moments that had nothing to do with treaties or trade routes, only the simple pleasure of her company. One evening, several weeks after the treaty had been fully settled and House Ashworth's influence had crumbled into irrelevance, Alistair found Alira in the estate's library, seated near the tall windows with a book open in her lap, though her attention seemed to have drifted toward the darkening sky outside. "You look troubled," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Not troubled," she said, closing the book gently. "Only thinking." It has been strange, these past weeks, adjusting to a life so different from the one I expected when I first came to this household. Strange in a good way, I hope. A faint smile touched her lips. Yes, though I confess I sometimes wonder if it is truly real, or if I will wake one morning and find myself back among the staff, pouring tea in silence as though none of this happened. It is real, Alistair said, and it will remain real, regardless of what House Ashworth or anyone else attempts against this household in the future. You earned your place here through your own courage and intelligence, not through any favor I granted lightly. Elira studied him for a long moment, something thoughtful in her expression. May I ask you something, Your Grace? Always. Why did you choose to trust me so completely, that very first morning in your study? You barely knew me. I was a maid you had likely passed a dozen times without truly seeing, and yet you believed my word over a man who had served you faithfully, or so you believed, for 6 years. Alistair considered the question carefully before answering. Because you had nothing to gain by lying to me, and everything to lose. Delacroix's deception served his own interests. Your honesty served no one but the truth itself. That distinction mattered more to me than any title or years of service. That is a wise way to measure trust, Elira said quietly. It is a lesson I learned rather painfully, Alistair admitted, a wry note entering his voice. 6 years of misplaced confidence in the wrong person has a way of sharpening one's judgment considerably. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the library growing dim as evening settled fully over the estate, a single lamp casting warm light across the space between them. Alistair found himself studying her face in the soft glow, the sharp intelligence in her eyes that had first caught his attention during that tense morning meeting, now softened by something gentler, something that had grown steadily between them through weeks of shared purpose and quiet conversation. Elira, he said finally, I have been considering something, and I find I can no longer keep it to myself. She looked up at him, her expression curious, waiting. When I offered you the position of translator and advisor, I told myself it was purely a matter of practicality, that I needed someone I could trust completely for future negotiations. That much remains true, but it was never only that. I have found myself, over these past weeks, valuing your presence in ways that extend well beyond matters of diplomacy. Elira's breath caught slightly, though she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. I understand the difference in our positions creates certain complications, Alistair continued, and I understand you may have every reason to be cautious about what I am suggesting. But I find I care for you, Elira, beyond anything I expected when you first whispered those 4 words to me at the reception. I would like to know if that feeling might, in any way, be returned. For a long moment, Elira said nothing, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face, warm and genuine, unlike any expression Alistair had seen from her before. I have wondered, she said softly, whether I was imagining the way you have looked at me these past weeks, or hoping for something I had no right to expect. I did not dare speak of it myself, given everything that has changed so quickly. Then, I am not imagining it either, Alistair said, something like relief loosening the tension in his chest. No, Elira said, you are not. He reached across the space between them and took her hand gently, and she did not pull away. The lamplight flickered softly against the library shelves, and outside, the last light of evening faded fully into night, but neither of them moved to light another lamp, content to remain in the quiet, comfortable dark. 2 people who had found in each other something neither had expected to find, born from a single whispered warning that had changed the course of both their lives. In the months that followed, the household adjusted fully to the new order of things, the staff no longer whispering in surprise when the Duke sought Elira's company, beyond matters of diplomacy, but rather nodding with quiet approval, having watched the story unfold from the very beginning, from a whispered warning at a crowded reception, to a partnership built on honesty, courage, and trust earned rather than assumed. Minister Pharaoh's kingdom became one of the estate's most reliable trading partners in the years that followed, the treaty that had nearly collapsed under Delacroix's deception, instead becoming a foundation for lasting cooperation between the 2 nations, strengthened rather than weakened by the honesty that had ultimately prevailed. House Ashworth never fully recovered its standing among the nobility, its ambitions permanently curtailed by its own corruption. Nearly a year after that first whispered warning at the crowded reception, Alistair stood once again in the same grand hall, though the room now held a very different kind of gathering. Nobles from across the region had been invited, along with Minister Pharaoh, who had traveled a considerable distance to attend, and members of the household staff who had watched this story unfold from its very beginning. from Margaret Colby down to the youngest kitchen boy who still remembered the morning the entire household had gathered to hear the truth about Delacroix's betrayal. Alistair stood at the center of the hall, Elira beside him, dressed not in the gray uniform she had once worn, but in fine blue silk that suited her position as the estate's most trusted advisor and translator. The chatter of the gathered guests quieted as he raised his hand, the room settling into an expectant hush. "A year ago," Alistair began, "this very hall witnessed a moment that changed the course of this household entirely. A maid, moving quietly among these guests, chose courage over silence, and in doing so, saved a treaty, exposed a conspiracy, and revealed a truth that might otherwise have remained hidden forever." He turned to Elira, taking her hand gently in front of the assembled crowd. "In the months since, I have come to understand that what she offered this house was not simply honesty in a moment of crisis, but a partnership built on trust I have found nowhere else in my life. I do not intend to let that partnership remain confined to matters of diplomacy alone." He lowered himself to one knee, and a ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the gathered nobility, though the household staff, who had watched this story grow over many months, merely exchanged knowing smiles. "Elira," Alistair said, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not merely my advisor and translator, but my partner in every sense, for the rest of our lives?" Elira's eyes shone with unshed tears as she looked down at him, her earlier composure giving way entirely to something raw and joyful. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Yes, I will." The hall erupted into applause, Margaret Colby wiping tears from her own eyes as she watched the maid she had once assigned to serve tea now accept a proposal from the Duke himself. Minister Farrow stepped forward first among the guests to offer his congratulations, remarking through a broad smile that he had known from that very morning in the garden that this young woman was destined for far more than anyone around her had first realized. In the weeks that followed, the wedding was arranged with careful attention, drawing guests from across the region, including several houses that had once maintained cautious distance from the Whitmore estate, but now sought closer ties, eager to align themselves with a duke whose reputation for honesty and fairness had only grown since the scandal that first tested it so thoroughly. House Ashworth, still struggling to rebuild what remained of its standing, sent no representative, its absence noted by everyone present but mourned by no one. On the day of the wedding itself, standing before the gathered guests in the same gardens where Elira had once translated a private conversation that saved a treaty and changed both their lives, Alistair looked at the woman beside him and felt, for the first time in years, that every careful negotiation, every hard-won treaty, every diplomatic triumph of his life meant far less than this single, quiet certainty. He had built his reputation on trust freely given and occasionally betrayed, but in Elira, he had found something that would never require testing again. And within the Whitmore estate, a maid who had once moved unnoticed through crowded halls became something far greater than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined, not through connections or noble birth, but through the simple, unwavering courage to speak the truth when silence would have been so much easier, and through a duke wise enough to listen when she did. The first 2 years of their marriage passed with a quiet steadiness neither of them had fully expected after the turmoil that first brought them together. Alistair's estate flourished under their combined guidance, trade agreements multiplying as word spread of the Duke's reputation for fairness, and his wife's remarkable skill in bridging even the most difficult conversations between distant houses and foreign courts. Elira, once a maid who moved unnoticed through crowded halls, had become one of the most respected voices in regional diplomacy, sought after by other noble houses hoping to borrow her counsel for their own delicate negotiations. Alistair often found himself marveling at how naturally she had grown into this new life, how the same sharp instincts that had once allowed her to detect a single lie hidden within a foreign minister's translated words now served her in matters far broader than any single negotiation. She had a way of reading a room, of sensing tension before it surfaced, that made her invaluable at every gathering they attended together. Then, 2 years into their marriage, a new challenge arrived at the Whitmore estate, one that neither Alistair nor Elira had anticipated. A delegation from a distant northern kingdom requested an audience, seeking a trade agreement far more complex than the one that had first brought Elira into Alistair's confidence. This kingdom spoke a language even Elira did not know, and the negotiations would require navigating unfamiliar customs, unfamiliar expectations, and a court known for its shrewd, demanding diplomats. Elira approached the challenge with the same careful determination that had defined her from the very beginning. She spent weeks studying what records the estate possessed of the Northern Kingdom's language and customs, consulting traveling merchants who had dealt with the region, and preparing herself thoroughly before the delegation's arrival. Alistair watched her work late into the evenings, poring over notes by candlelight, and found himself once again admiring the quiet discipline that had first drawn his attention on that tense morning in his study years earlier. When the Northern delegation finally arrived, led by a stern ambassador named Corwin Ashford, the early meetings proved tense. Ambassador Ashford seemed determined to test the Whitmore estate's resolve, presenting demands that bordered on unreasonable, watching closely for any sign of weakness or hesitation. Illyra, though not yet fully fluent in the Northern tongue, had prepared enough to catch subtle inconsistencies in the translations provided by the delegation's own interpreter, a young man named Nathaniel Cross, who seemed nervous throughout the early sessions. "Something is not right," Illyra told Alistair privately after the second day of negotiations. "Nathaniel's translations are technically accurate, but he consistently omits certain phrases, softening the ambassador's more aggressive demands before relaying them to us. I do not believe he is being dishonest for personal gain, as Delacroix was. I believe he is frightened of his own ambassador and softening the demands out of fear rather than malice." Alistair considered this carefully. If that is true, then perhaps the real obstacle is not deception, but fear. Ambassador Ashford's own harshness may be preventing an honest negotiation from taking place at all. Illyra nodded slowly. "I believe the ambassador himself may not fully understand how his demands sound to us, precisely because his own interpreter is too afraid to convey them honestly in either direction. It is possible neither side truly understands the other, not through malice this time, but through fear and misunderstanding layered on top of each other." Together, they devised a different approach than the one they had used against Delacroix years earlier. Rather than exposing Nathaniel publicly, which might only deepen his fear and damage the negotiation further, Alistair invited the young interpreter to a private conversation, with Illyra present to help bridge any remaining language gaps. "I understand this negotiation feels difficult," Alistair said gently, once the three of them were alone. "But I need your honest translation, exactly as spoken, even when the words feel harsh. I promise you, no negotiation succeeds when either side is left guessing at the other's true meaning." Nathaniel's hands trembled slightly as he considered this. "Ambassador Ashford does not tolerate translators who make him appear anything less than commanding, Your Grace. I fear for my position if I translate his words too plainly, and I fear his temper if I fail to represent him well." "Then let me speak with the ambassador directly," Alistair said. "Not to undermine you, but to make clear that I value honesty over performance, and that a truthful translation serves his interests as much as mine." The following morning, Alistair requested a private meeting with Ambassador Ashford, Illyra and Nathaniel both present. He spoke plainly, explaining that he suspected the negotiations had been hindered not by dishonesty, but by fear, and that he wished to proceed with complete transparency going forward, promising that blunt words, honestly translated, would never be held against either interpreter. Ambassador Ashford, initially defensive, gradually softened as the conversation continued, admitting that he had indeed grown frustrated with negotiations that seemed to circle without progress, unaware that his own interpreter's fear had been quietly reshaping every exchange. Once Nathaniel began translating honestly, without softening or omitting difficult phrases, the negotiations shifted entirely, moving forward with a clarity that had been missing since the delegation's arrival. The remaining sessions moved with a swiftness that surprised even Alistair, who had grown accustomed to negotiations stretching for weeks under the weight of misunderstanding and caution. With honest translation finally flowing in both directions, Ambassador Ashford's true priorities became clear, and many of the demands that had initially seemed unreasonable turned out to be simple misunderstandings of custom rather than genuine points of conflict. What the ambassador's own countrymen considered a standard courtesy in trade agreements, the Whitmore estate had never encountered before, and once explained plainly, proved easy enough to accommodate. Nathaniel, freed from the fear that had shaped his earlier translations, grew visibly more confident with each passing session, his voice steadier, his translations sharper and more precise. Illyra took him aside privately one afternoon, offering quiet encouragement that Alistair later learned had meant a great deal to the young man, who confided that he had never before worked under an employer willing to prioritize honesty over appearance. Within days, an agreement was reached that satisfied both sides, built not on performance or fear, but on the same honest exchange that had defined Alistair and Illyra's partnership from its very beginning. Ambassador Ashford, before departing, remarked to Alistair that he had never before encountered a house so committed to truthful negotiation, and that he intended to recommend the Whitmore estate to every trading partner within his own kingdom's reach. As the northern delegation's carriages rolled away from the estate, Alistair stood beside Alira on the front steps, much as he had stood there years earlier on the night she first whispered a warning into his ear. "You handled that beautifully," he said, recognizing fear where I might have only seen deception. "I learned that lesson from watching how differently Delacroix and Coyle behaved compared to how frightened Nathaniel seemed," Alira said. "Not every difficult translation hides a scheme. Sometimes it only hides a frightened young man trying to survive an impossible position." Alistair smiled, drawing her closer as the last of the northern carriages disappeared down the drive. "You have a gift for seeing what others miss entirely." "I had a good teacher in learning to trust that gift," she said. "A duke who chose to believe a maid's whispered warning, instead of dismissing it outright." Their partnership continued to grow over the following years, their household becoming known throughout the region not only for its successful diplomacy, but for the unusual honesty and fairness that guided every negotiation conducted within its halls. Young servants who joined the estate staff were told, often within their first week, the story of the maid who had once whispered a warning to a duke and changed the course of the household forever. A story that had become something of a quiet legend among those who served there. Margaret Colby, now older and slower in her duties, often told the story to new maids as they settled into their roles, reminding them that courage and honesty mattered more than station, and that even the quietest voice, if it spoke the truth, could change everything. Years later, when their eldest daughter, a sharp-eyed girl with her mother's steady gaze, asked how her parents had first come to know each other, Alistair and Alira would tell the story together, each filling in details the other had forgotten, the tale of a whispered warning at a crowded reception growing gently into legend within their own family, passed down as a reminder that truth, however dangerous to speak, was always worth the risk. Their daughter, in turn, grew up watching her parents work side by side in the same study where the truth had first been uncovered years before, absorbing without quite realizing it the same lessons that had shaped their partnership from its very beginning, that careful listening mattered more than easy assumptions, and that the quietest person in a crowded room sometimes carried the most important truth of all. Even Minister Farrow, who visited the estate occasionally in the years that followed to renew old trade agreements and share news from his own kingdom, often remarked that the Whitmore household had become something of a model for how honest diplomacy ought to function, a rare example among noble houses that too often let pride and secrecy dictate their dealings with one another. He never failed to mention, with a warm smile, that he had known from that very first morning in the garden mist that Alira possessed a gift too rare to remain hidden behind a maid's uniform. House Ashworth, meanwhile, faded slowly from relevance over the years, its influence never fully recovering from the scandal that had first exposed its scheming. Lord Ashworth himself grew older and quieter, his ambitions curbed by the lasting consequences of choices made in a single desperate attempt to undermine a treaty that had, in the end, only grown stronger for having survived his interference. The Whitmore estate remained, for generations after, a household defined by the same principle that had first brought its duke and his most trusted advisor together, that honesty, however difficult, always mattered more than comfortable silence, and that courage, wherever it was found, deserved to be recognized and rewarded rather than overlooked.